The garbage truck's metal arm lifted the last piece of my life into the air, its engine groaning under the weight of my past. My name is Eleanor Miller, and at 72 years old, I thought I'd seen it all. But I had never seen my own son, Mark, stand silently on the porch while his wife, Jessica, watched my memories get crushed with a triumphant smile on her face. A neighbour across the street peered through her blinds, her face a mask of pity, but no one moved, no one said a word. Friend, before I tell you about the one secret hidden in that trash that would bring their perfect world crashing down, do me a kindness. Tap subscribe so you're here to see what happens when they finally push a good woman too far. I promise you, their reaction is worth the wait. I stood there on the lawn, frozen, as the truck swallowed the black bags whole. One of them contained a dusty old painting of a sunset, a silly souvenir my late husband Richard had bought on our honeymoon 40 years ago. He always said it held the last bit of warmth from the best day of his life. To Jessica, it was just junk. I watched the truck drive away, my heart a hollow ache in my chest, having no idea that they hadn't just thrown away a memory. They had thrown away a multi-million-dollar fortune. It had started slowly, this erasure of my life. After my husband Richard passed, the visits from my son Mark and his wife Jessica felt less like family gatherings and more like inspections. Jessica would walk through my home, her finger tracing invisible lines of dust on Richard's favourite bookshelf. Her smile was as brittle as thin ice, and her comments were like tiny, sharp cuts. "It's just so cluttered in here, Eleanor," she'd say, loud enough for me to hear from the kitchen. "A person can hardly breathe." The things she called junk were the pillars of my world. A jar of seashells from our first trip to the coast, a hand-carved bird Richard made one winter, and of course the painting. It hung in his study, a simple canvas of a brown and orange sunset. It would never be in a museum, but it was priceless to me. To Jessica, it was an eyesore, another piece of the past she was so desperate to scrub away. Last Tuesday, I overheard her corner Mark in the hallway. Her voice was a low, urgent hiss. "We have to do something about this, Mark. It's a health hazard. If she won't, then we will." I saw the look on my son's face, a mixture of guilt and resignation. I knew then that a storm was coming, but I had no idea it would wash my whole world away. They ambushed me over dinner that Sunday. Jessica slid a glossy brochure across the polished wood of my dining table, the one Richard had spent a month refinishing. "Surprise," she announced, her voice a little too bright. "We've hired a professional home organisation service for you. They're going to do a complete declutter. Think of it as our anniversary gift to you." My fork clattered against my plate. A gift? This felt more like a home invasion. I looked at my son, Mark, pleading with my eyes, but he just stared at his mashed potatoes as if they held the secrets of the universe. "It'll be good for you, Mum," he mumbled, never once looking at me. I tried to refuse, my voice shaking slightly. "I don't want strangers touching my things," I said. "They're Richard's things." But Jessica's smile only tightened. "Oh, Eleanor, don't be silly. It's already booked and paid for. They're coming this Friday while you're at your doctor's appointment. That way you won't have to worry about a thing." And just like that, my voice was silenced. My home was no longer my own. The decision had been made for me. All I could do was sit there, listening to the clock on the wall tick down the hours until the invasion. Friday morning felt like a funeral. The whole drive to my doctor's appointment, I wasn't thinking about my blood pressure. I was picturing strangers in my house, their hands on Richard's things, deciding what was worthy of keeping. Every minute that ticked by in the waiting room was a minute that my life was being judged and discarded. When the nurse finally said I could leave, I almost ran to my car, a cold dread sitting like a stone in my stomach. The house was too quiet when I walked in. The familiar scent of old books and Richard's pipe tobacco was gone, replaced by the sharp, sterile smell of lemon cleaner. I walked through the living room, which looked like a sad hotel lobby, and my feet carried me to the one place that was truly sacred, Richard's study. I pushed open the door and the air was stolen right out of my lungs. The bookshelves were empty, His big, comfortable armchair was gone, and the walls were a ghostly shade of white. It was a tomb, a hollowed-out shell of the life we had built together. I stumbled backward, a cry catching in my throat. My eyes scanned the bare walls, searching for something, anything, that was left of him. But there was nothing. Just a single gleaming new nail where his favourite painting used to hang, mocking the empty space where 40 years of a memory should have been. My heart hammered against my ribs as I ran out the front door. There, lined up on the curb like soldiers of doom, were 3 enormous black trash bags. I tore the first one open with trembling hands. Inside, a shattered picture frame, Richard's old reading glasses, and the letters I had written to him during the war, ripped in half. A sob escaped my lips as my son's wife, Jessica, came out onto the porch, her phone pressed to her ear, laughing about some new restaurant. She saw me, and her face hardened into a mask of annoyance. "Eleanor, what are you doing?" she snapped. "The truck is coming any minute. You're making a mess." But it was too late. Just as she spoke, the roar of the garbage truck filled the street. Its brakes hissed as it stopped in front of my house. I saw it then, the corner of the painting's old wooden frame sticking out of the second bag. I screamed, a useless thin sound against the noise of the engine. The mechanical arm unfolded, grabbing the bags and lifting them into the sky. I watched, helpless, as my husband's memory, our sunset, was swallowed whole by the belly of the machine. It was only later that night, crying in the cold silence of his empty study, that my hand brushed against a loose floorboard beneath his old desk. Hidden there was a leather folder I'd never seen before, and inside it was a secret that would turn my grief into a weapon. My hands shook as I pulled the heavy leather folder from its hiding place. Inside, resting on top of a stack of papers, was a certificate with a gold seal and the name of a famous artist I'd only read about in books. Below it was an official valuation document, dated just a year before Richard passed. I scanned the page until my eyes landed on a number that didn't seem real, $2,000. For a moment, the world tilted, the number so huge it had no meaning. But it wasn't the money that made me gasp for air. It was the letter tucked behind it, in Richard's familiar, sloping handwriting. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "I bought this for a song, a silly honeymoon souvenir. Turns out it's the real deal. I'm keeping this a secret for us. Let the world see an old dusty painting. All I will ever see is you, that day, that sunset. A memory worth more than all the money in the world." The tears that came now were different. They weren't tears of grief, but of rage. Jessica hadn't just thrown away a valuable object. She had spat on a sacred secret, a final love letter from my husband. My breathing steadied, and a cold, hard resolve settled in my chest. They thought they had erased my past. They had no idea they had just armed my future. The next morning, I made my first move. There would be no shouting, no accusations. Not yet. My grief was now a cloak, and I wore it perfectly. I called my son Mark, and when he answered, I let my voice crack and tremble. I told him the garbage truck had come. I told him the painting, his father's painting, was gone forever. I cried, making sure he could hear the sound of a heartbroken old woman on the other end of the line. He was quiet for a moment, and then he let out a heavy, impatient sigh. "Mum, it was just an old painting," he said, his voice laced with the kind of strained patience one uses for a child. "Listen, Jessica bought you a beautiful new print of a beach to put there. You'll love it. It's much more cheerful." Cheerful. He thought a cheap print could replace a memory that had warmed our home for 40 years. I played my part. I thanked him through my fake tears and told him he was a good son. He hung up, probably feeling relieved that he had handled his hysterical old mother so well. He had no idea he wasn't talking to a victim anymore. He was talking to a hunter, and I was just beginning to learn the scent of my prey. I knew I couldn't do this alone. My anger was afire, but I needed a weapon, and that weapon was knowledge. I went through Richard's old Rolodex, the one Jessica had almost thrown out, and my fingers stopped on a name: Arthur Davies, Fine Art Appraisals. Richard had spoken to him once, years ago. My heart pounded as I dialed the number, feeling like a spy in my own life, a stranger to the woman I used to be. I explained the situation to Mr. Davies, keeping my voice low and steady. I told him I had the authentication papers for a long-lost painting, but that the artwork itself had been accidentally discarded. There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice suddenly grave and urgent. "Do you understand what you're telling me? If those papers are real, that painting isn't just valuable, it's a piece of history." He told me to bring the documents to his office immediately, but then he gave me a warning that sent a chill down my spine. "Do not speak to anyone else about this," he commanded. "A piece like that being in the wild is a dangerous thing. There are people who would do anything to get their hands on it." Suddenly the stakes were higher than I ever could have imagined. My son Mark came over that evening, holding a large rectangular object wrapped in brown paper. He tore it open with a flourish, revealing a cheap, generic print of a lighthouse. "See, Mum? A fresh new look," he said, his smile so forced it looked painful. I looked into my son's eyes, the same eyes I had adored since he was a baby, and I searched for any sign of remorse. I found nothing but emptiness. I decided to set my first trap. "Mark," I said softly, my voice still watery with pretend grief. "I know Jessica planned all this, but when did you two actually decide to do it? It all felt so sudden." I watched him closely, watching the way his eyes darted away from mine, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Oh, you know Jessica," he stammered, running a hand through his hair. "She gets an idea in her head, and it just sort of happens. It was all very last minute, Mum. A spur-of-the-moment thing." He was lying, a terrible, clumsy lie. And in that moment, listening to him defend his wife's cruelty, the last flicker of hope I had for my son died. He wasn't just a bystander in this crime, he was a conspirator, and I knew exactly how I was going to prove it. That night, after my son, Mark, had left, his lie echoed in the silent house. "Last minute," he'd said. I walked to the old family computer in the corner of the living room, my hands trembling. I felt a pang of guilt, like I was crossing a line a mother should never cross, but his betrayal had already burned that bridge. I logged into his email account. The password was Buddy, the name of the golden retriever he'd loved so much as a boy. The irony was a bitter pill. I typed Jessica's name into the search bar, and my breath caught in my throat. There it was. An email chain from 3 weeks ago with a subject line that made my stomach clench. Project Mom's House. My eyes scanned the messages, a cold timeline of their plot. Jessica had sent Mark links to new, sterile furniture and paint colours. They had discussed which days I would be out of the house. It was all there, a cold, calculated plan. But it was the last email, a reply from my own son, that shattered what was left of my heart. I read the words over and over, hoping my eyes were deceiving me. "Sounds good," he'd written to his wife. "Just make sure you get rid of that awful brown painting in the study. I've hated it since I was a kid." The words blurred through my tears. This wasn't just his wife's plan. He had been an architect of my heartbreak all along. The discovery of Mark's email was a colder, heavier grief than Richard's passing. My husband had been taken from me by fate, but my son had been stolen by the casual cruelty of his own choices. For a full day I did nothing. I sat in the empty study, staring at the blank wall, feeling a profound and terrifying loneliness. I thought about printing the email, about marching over to his house and shoving it in his face. I imagined screaming at him, asking him how he could do it. For a moment I almost gave in to the rage. I wanted to hurt him the way he had hurt me. But then I thought of his face, the way he'd look shocked, then guilty, then full of excuses. He and Jessica would apologise. They would promise to make it right. They'd be forgiven, and I'd be left with nothing but the ashes of my anger. Was that justice? To give them the easy comfort of an apology? No. A shouting match was a fire that would burn out in minutes. What they deserved was a slow, cold freeze. They had plotted for weeks to dismantle my life, treating my memories like items on a checklist. It was only fair that I take my time planning how to dismantle theirs. My new mission began not with a bang, but with a phone call. I put on my best frail old woman voice, the one that sounded slightly confused and helpless, and I dialed the town's sanitation department. I told the clerk who answered that I was a widow, and in a muddle, I had accidentally thrown out a box of very sentimental things, including a painting of my late husband's. The woman on the phone was kind but firm. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry to hear that," she said gently. "But once it's in the truck, it all goes to the same place, the county landfill. There's really nothing we can do." My heart sank. Was it really over? Was Richard's painting, our $2 million secret, really buried under tons of garbage? I felt a wave of despair wash over me. But then, just as I was about to thank her and hang up, she added one more thing. "The only exception," she said, "is if a driver flags something for the county salvage yard. Sometimes if they see old furniture or something that looks like art, they'll set it aside instead of crushing it." A tiny flicker of hope ignited in the darkness. It was a 1 in a million chance, but it was the only chance I had. My next phone call would be to a yard full of forgotten things. That flicker of hope was all I needed. The clerk from the sanitation department gave me the number for the county salvage yard, a place I never imagined I'd be calling. A gruff, gravelly voice answered on the second ring. "Yeah, what do you want?" I took a deep breath and began my story again, the sad widow who accidentally threw away a sentimental painting. The man, who introduced himself as Sal, laughed. It was a harsh, humourless sound. "Lady, you know how much stuff comes through here every day? I ain't got time to look for your hubby's old picture." My heart sank. This was it. A dead end. I was about to thank him for his time and hang up, to let the fragile hope die out completely. But then, I remembered my son Mark's own cruel words from the email. That awful brown painting. I changed my tactic. "I know it's a long shot," I said, letting my voice sound small. "But it was a very particular painting, very brown. An ugly old thing, I suppose, to anyone but me." There was a sudden pause on the other end of the line. The gruff wall of disinterest suddenly had a crack in it. "Brown, you say?" Sal asked slowly, his tone changing completely. "Maybe I did see something like that." "You saw it?" I asked, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could hear Sal breathing on the other end, thinking. "Yeah," he finally said. "It looked different. Old. So I pulled it off the line before it went to the crusher." Relief washed over me so intensely I felt dizzy. It was safe. The painting was safe. For a moment, I thought it was over, that I had won. But I was wrong. "Here's the thing, lady," Sal continued, his voice taking on a greedy edge. "Finders keepers. It's my property now." My relief vanished, replaced by a cold dread. He wasn't going to just give it back. "If you want it," he grunted, "you got to buy it back from me." My mind raced. I couldn't tell him what it was worth. He would never let it go. I had to play his game. "How much?" I asked, praying it was a number I could manage. But Sal didn't answer right away. Instead, he said something that made my blood run cold. "Tell you what, before the truck even got to your curb, I saw your daughter-in-law out there talking to a junk dealer. She sold him a few things right off the pile." A junk dealer? Why would Jessica do that? My mind couldn't make sense of it until Sal's next words revealed a truth far uglier than I could have ever imagined. "She sold him that painting," Sal said, and I could practically hear the smirk in his voice. "The junk dealer offered her $50 for the ugly old frame, and she took it. Laughed about it too. Said she was happy to get anything for that piece of junk." $50. The number echoed in the silent room. My daughter-in-law, Jessica, hadn't just thrown away my husband's memory. She had sold it. She had held it in her hands, looked at the last gift my husband ever gave me, and decided it was worth $50. The sheer, breathtaking disrespect of it all stole the air from my lungs. This wasn't just about carelessness anymore. This was a deliberate act of insult, a final stamp of her own perceived superiority on my life, my love, my past. Sal went on, explaining that he'd seen the whole exchange and figured if the junk dealer wanted it, it must be worth something, which is why he grabbed it from the truck later. So, he finished, if she got $50 for it, and I saved it from the crusher, my price is $1,000. Cash. $1,000. It was nothing compared to $2 million, but it felt like a fortune built on filth. I agreed to his price, but I told him I needed a few days. It wasn't because I needed time to get the cash. I needed time to figure out how to use this new, disgusting piece of the puzzle to build the perfect trap. The first person I called was the art expert, Mr. Davies. My voice was no longer trembling. It was cold and precise. I told him the painting was safe, but then I told him about the $50 sale. There was a long, stunned silence on the other end of the line. "My dear woman," he finally said, his voice a mixture of shock and outrage. "This changes everything. Your daughter-in-law hasn't just been disrespectful, she has committed a crime. It's called conversion, the unlawful sale of property that doesn't belong to you. He told me we could go to the police, that we could have her charged." For a moment, I considered it. I pictured Jessica in a courtroom, her perfect facade cracking under the harsh lights. But Mr. Davies offered another path. "An arrest would make this public before you are ready," he advised. "It would take the control out of your hands. There is a quieter, more effective way to handle this." I listened as he laid out a plan. It was simple, elegant, and utterly ruthless. "Go get the painting, Mrs. Miller," he instructed. "Pay the man his $1,000, but you must get a receipt, a very detailed receipt." He explained that the small, greasy piece of paper would become the one thing my daughter-in-law couldn't argue with. It would be the lock on the cage I was about to build for her. I drove to the salvage yard the next day, the $1,000 in cash tucked into an old envelope in my purse. The place smelled of rust and damp earth, a graveyard for forgotten things. Sal was waiting for me, leaning against a mountain of scrap metal, his arms crossed over his chest. He led me into a dark, dusty shed, and there it was, leaning against a stack of old tires, wrapped in a dirty blanket. My heart ached, with a strange mix of relief and sorrow. He counted the $100 bills twice, his suspicious eyes never leaving my face. Then, as I had asked, he found a greasy notepad and a pen. He painstakingly wrote out a receipt. Received $1,000 cash from Eleanor Miller for one old brown painting, sold as is. He signed his name with a flourish and handed me the paper. It felt heavier than all the money I had just given him. I carefully placed the painting in the back of my car, its presence a warm weight of profound relief. It was home. But as I drove away from that yard of forgotten things, my hand wasn't on the steering wheel. It was on the greasy receipt in my pocket. The painting was the heart of my story, but this little piece of paper, this was the dagger. That weekend, just as Mr. Davies predicted, the perfect opportunity fell right into my lap. My phone rang, and Jessica's overly cheerful voice chirped on the other end. "Eleanor, I have the most wonderful news. Now that the house is finally looking presentable, Mark and I are throwing a big housewarming party in a few weeks. To celebrate its new chapter, you absolutely have to be there." The irony was so thick I could have choked on it. She was throwing a party to celebrate my erasure. "That sounds lovely, dear," I said, my voice as sweet as honey. It was a perfect stage, filled with her friends, her circle, the very people whose approval she craved like a drug. It was more than I could have ever hoped for. "Wonderful," she gushed. "And everyone is just dying to see how we've brightened the place up. It's like we've finally let it breathe." I smiled into the phone, a cold, sharp smile she couldn't see. Oh, it will be a party everyone remembers for years to come, I thought to myself. But it won't be for your new decorations. As the date of the party grew closer, something about Jessica's frantic energy started to bother me. Her constant posts on social media about the new decorations, the expensive catering, the designer dress she was going to wear. It all felt less like a celebration and more like a desperate performance. It wasn't just vanity. It was something deeper, something hungrier. On a hunch, I did something the old Eleanor would never have dreamed of. I called Mr. Davies, but not to talk about the painting. I asked him for a recommendation for a discreet private investigator. The report arrived a week later in a plain manila envelope. I sat at my kitchen table, my hands trembling as I read it. They were drowning. My son, Mark, and his wife Jessica were buried under a mountain of secret debt. Maxed out credit cards, a second mortgage on their own house, a series of catastrophic investments Mark had made without telling anyone. They were living in a palace of cards, and the slightest breeze would bring it all crashing down. Suddenly, it all made a sickening kind of sense. The push to declutter, the talk of a fresh start, the urgency to erase my past. It was never about style or making me comfortable. They were trying to make my house easier to sell. They weren't redecorating my home. They were staging it for liquidation, with me still inside. The knowledge of their desperation hit me harder than I expected. For a moment, my anger was replaced by a hollow, aching pity. I looked at an old photo on the mantel, one of Mark as a little boy on his first bicycle, his face beaming with pride. Was this revenge I was planning really worth it? Was I becoming as cold and calculating as they were? The thought made me feel ill. They were my family, and they were in trouble. A part of me, the mother in me, just wanted to help. I sat in Richard's study, the investigator's report in my lap, and I felt truly torn. Was I doing the right thing? Destroying them publicly seemed so final, so cruel. Maybe I should just confront them, show them I knew everything, and offer them a way out. It would be the kinder thing to do, the thing the old Eleanor would have done. But then my eyes fell upon Richard's letter, still sitting on the desk. I remembered Jessica's triumphant smile as she sold his memory for a pitiful $50. My moment of weakness passed. Desperation is not an excuse for betrayal. They could have come to me for help. Instead, they chose to rob me. I picked up the phone to make the final arrangements. There would be no more mercy. My first call was to Mr. Davies. I told him my plan for the party, and he was silent for a moment before letting out a low whistle. "Well, Mrs. Miller," he said, "when you decide to fight back, you certainly don't pull any punches." I told him I needed one more thing, an undeniable authority. I didn't want to just be an old woman making a wild claim. I needed an expert to back me up. He knew just the person. Dr. Alistair Finch, the head curator from the City Museum of Art. Mr. Davies explained the situation, and Dr. Finch, who had studied the artist extensively, was intrigued. He agreed to attend the party, posing simply as an old friend of the family. The most important piece of my trap was now in place. My final step was to prepare the evidence. I couldn't risk bringing the real $2 million painting to a party. Instead, I took it to a professional photography studio and had a high-resolution, life-sized photo of it taken. I had the photograph beautifully framed, so it looked exactly like a real piece of art. With the framed photograph safely hidden in my closet and a world-renowned art expert on the guest list, the stage was set. All I had to do now was walk into the lion's den and wait for Jessica to hand me the microphone. There was one final piece of the trap I needed to set. Exposing their greed was one thing, but I knew that even after the humiliation, a part of them would still be waiting. Waiting for the day my house and my savings would become theirs. They would swallow their pride and play the part of dutiful family, knowing that their inheritance was the ultimate prize. I decided it was time to take that prize off the table for good. I made an appointment with my lawyer, Mrs. Gable, a sharp woman who had handled our affairs for 20 years. I sat in her quiet, leather-bound office and told her everything. I showed her the investigator's report on their debt, the receipt from the salvage yard, and a copy of Richard's letter. She listened without a single interruption, her expression growing more serious with every word I spoke. When I was finished, she simply nodded. "What do you want to do, Eleanor?" she asked. "I want to change my will," I said, my voice as steady as steel. "I want the house to be left to the State Historical Preservation Society, and I want the entire contents, along with my savings, to be auctioned, with all proceeds going to the children's hospital Richard used to support." As I signed my name on the final page, I felt no sadness for what my son was losing. I only felt peace for what my husband and I were preserving. The day of the party arrived, a bright, sunny Saturday that felt like a mockery of the storm that was about to break. My phone rang that morning, and it was Jessica, her voice a little strained from the stress of party planning. "Just calling to remind you, Eleanor," she chirped. "And please," she added, her tone shifting to one of a stern parent, "let's keep things positive tonight. No sad stories about the old days, okay? It's a celebration." "Of course, dear," I said, a slow smile spreading across my face. "I'm only looking toward the future." After I hung up, I went to Richard's study. I stood in the empty room holding a framed photo of him, and I told him what I was about to do. I felt his strength settle over me, a quiet approval that chased away any lingering doubt. I got dressed, not in my usual beige or grey, but in a deep red dress I hadn't worn since our last anniversary. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a grieving widow. I saw a woman I hadn't seen in a very long time, a woman with fire in her eyes. I took one last look in the mirror, smoothed down the red dress, and picked up my purse. The battle was about to begin, but I felt no fear. After all, they were the ones trespassing in my home. I arrived just as the party was kicking into high gear. The house was filled with loud music and the braying laughter of strangers, all of them admiring Jessica's cold, grey walls. I didn't come alone. At my side was a distinguished silver-haired gentleman in a tweed jacket. I found Jessica by the champagne fountain and introduced him. "Jessica, dear, this is my old friend Alistair Finch." Jessica, who was busy basking in the glow of her own social triumph, barely gave him a glance. "How lovely," she said dismissively, before turning to greet someone she considered more important. She had no idea she had just shaken the hand of the man who was about to scientifically and methodically destroy her life in front of all her friends. Dr. Finch and I stood in a corner, observing the spectacle. My son, Mark, was following Jessica around like a lost puppy, a tray of appetizers in his hands. They were the king and queen of their castle of lies, completely oblivious. Dr. Finch gestured with his glass toward a particularly ugly splash of paint on the wall that had replaced Richard's painting. "She traded a masterpiece for that," he murmured, a hint of amusement in his voice. "She has no idea, does she?" I took a slow sip of my water. "No," I replied, "but she's about to." Just after 9 o'clock, when the champagne had been flowing for an hour, Jessica tapped a crystal glass with her fork. The room, which was my living room, fell silent. She stood in the centre of the crowd, my son Mark at her side, beaming. "I just want to thank you all for coming," she began, her voice ringing with false modesty, "and for helping us celebrate the new life we've breathed into this wonderful old house. It's a beautiful reminder that we can't live in the past, and that true value comes from moving forward and embracing a bright, clean future." The speech was a masterpiece of passive aggression, a series of thinly veiled insults aimed directly at me and the life I had built with Richard. Her friends, none of whom had ever stepped foot in this house before, applauded wildly. She looked right at me, a triumphant smirk dancing on her lips. Then, in a final, patronizing gesture, she turned the floor over to me. "And now, I believe my mother-in-law, Eleanor, has a few words she'd like to say." She handed me the microphone, expecting a few quiet, rambling words from the sad old woman in the corner. I took the cool metal, a steady weight in my hand. "Thank you, Jessica," I began, my voice clear and strong, cutting through the silence. You are right. It is so important to learn what things are truly worth. I let those words hang in the air for a moment, looking from my son's confused face to Jessica's smug one. My daughter-in-law's recent decluttering project, I continued, taught me a lesson I will never forget. Some of you may know that in her enthusiasm, a few of my sentimental things were discarded, including a very old, very brown painting my late husband Richard bought me on our honeymoon. I saw Jessica's smile falter. The air in the room grew tight. She thought it was junk, an eyesore, an ugly thing from the past that needed to be erased. I paused, letting the silence stretch until it was uncomfortable. In fact, I said, my voice dropping slightly, she felt it was worth so little that she sold it off my curb to a junk dealer for $50. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Jessica's face went from smug to confused to horrified in a matter of seconds. Her friends were now staring at her, their smiles gone, replaced by whispers. I watched her perfect party begin to crumble around her, and I knew it was time for the final blow. But here's the thing about value, Jessica, I said, looking her dead in the eye. Sometimes we can make a miscalculation, and I've brought a friend tonight who can explain just how big your miscalculation was. All eyes followed my hand as I gestured to the quiet, silver-haired man in the tweed jacket. My dear friend, Alistair Finch, I announced, is the head curator of the City Museum of Art. Alistair, perhaps you could tell everyone what that awful brown painting actually is. The name of the museum sent a second shockwave through the room. My son, Mark, looked like he had seen a ghost. Jessica's face was ashen. Dr. Finch stepped forward, his presence calm and authoritative. He cleared his throat. The painting Mrs. Miller is referring to, he began, his expert voice cutting through the whispers, is titled Carmel Sunset. It is the last known work of the celebrated artist Julian Croft. It has been missing from the art world for over 60 years. He let that sink in before delivering the final devastating sentence. He looked directly at Jessica, whose hand was trembling by her side, and said, "Its estimated value at a conservative auction would be $2 million. The number hung in the air, a ghost of a fortune she had sold for $50. And in the dead silence that followed, the only sound was the sharp crack of a champagne glass as it slipped from Jessica's fingers and shattered on the floor. The sound of the shattering glass broke the spell. The room erupted in a storm of whispers, every eye in the house fixed on my son, Mark, and his wife, Jessica. Her friends, the ones who had been admiring her new grey walls just minutes before, were now staring at her with a mixture of pity and morbid fascination. Her perfect party had become her public trial, and the verdict was already in. Jessica's face crumpled, not with shame, but with a raw, ugly greed. She rushed toward me, her hands grasping at my arm, her manicured nails digging into my skin. "Where is it, Eleanor?" she hissed, her voice a desperate, shrill cry. "We can get it back. We can sell it. That money could save us." In front of everyone, she had confessed. Her motivation wasn't style or a fresh start. It was a financial rescue mission. I pulled my arm away from her, my voice dropping to a calm, quiet tone that was somehow louder than her shouting. "Save you?" I asked. "Save you from your mountains of debt? The second mortgage you took on your house? Your husband's bad investments?" They stared at me, their faces a perfect picture of ruin. They finally understood that I didn't just know about the painting. I knew everything. I held up a hand, and the room, which had been buzzing with gossip, fell silent once more. I looked at my son, Mark, the boy whose scraped knees I had bandaged, and I felt the last bit of motherly softness inside me turn to stone. He had made his choice, and now he would live with it. "The painting is safe," I announced to the room, "and it will not be sold to pay for your mistakes. And since we are speaking of value and what is to be inherited," I continued, my eyes locked on his, "I think it's only fair to let you know that I met with my lawyer last week. I have made some new arrangements for my estate." I saw a flicker of panic in his eyes. Jessica held her breath. "This house," I said, my voice ringing with finality, "which you were so eager to empty, will be left to a historical trust to be preserved as it was when my husband was alive. The painting will be donated to the museum in his name, and the remainder of my assets will go to the children's hospital Richard supported his entire life." A strangled sob escaped Jessica's lips. They had lost it all. Not just the $2 million, but the house, the inheritance, their entire future. I placed the microphone on a nearby table and walked toward the door. I didn't look back. There was nothing left to see but the ashes of a life they had set on fire themselves. The next morning, I sat in Richard's study. The real painting was hanging back on the wall where it belonged, and the sun streamed through the window, catching the warm brown colours of the sunset we had watched together so long ago. My home was quiet again, but it was a peaceful silence now, not an empty one. My past was no longer under attack. It was safe. As I was putting Richard's old folder away, a document I'd overlooked slipped out. It was a deed, a title to a small, quiet cottage by the sea he had bought years ago, a secret place just for us that no one, not even Mark, knew about. I smiled. Perhaps it was time for another fresh start after all. But this time, it would be on my own terms. Friend, thank you for staying with me to the very end. If you believe that strength isn't about how you fall, but how you get back up, then please tap subscribe and join our community. You won't want to miss the stories we share next.